The U.S. is putting 8,500 troops on standby for potential deployment to Ukraine as Russia gathers its troops along the border.
In a news conference a short time ago, Pentagon spokesperson John Kirby said no final decision has been made, but prepare to deploy orders have been sent. The U.S. has also sent a second shipment of weapons to the country. The announcement comes after the U.S. ordered the families of Ukraine embassy staff members to leave the country immediately. Officials say the decision was made out of an abundance of caution. While Russia says it is not planning to invade the country, there are growing concerns an invasion is imminent.
For more on all of this, I want to bring in Peter Rao. He is a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute. Peter, heightened alert. Translate that for us.
Well, Ukraine borders 4 NATO states to which the United States has treaty commitments: Romania, Hungary, Slovakia, and Poland. Ukraine is also a Black Sea coastal country. Of course, Turkey and Bulgaria are additional NATO countries on the Black Sea. And so if the U.S. thinks that there is the possibility of an imminent invasion, the security situation for NATO changes altogether. Thankfully, in 2014, the last time Putin launched a major incursion into Ukraine, NATO created a rapid response force, which is tens of thousands of coalition troops. This is meant to send a signal to supplement that, and basically means that the Pentagon is putting units on alert to lessen their recall time. So if a unit is set to deploy or is wanting to deploy and it needs, say, 10 or 15 days, now it can deploy on a shorter time horizon just to provide assurance to our Eastern European allies.
And so, Peter, we listened to Pentagon spokesperson John Kirby's press conference. He said that there is no final decision being made yet on deployment, but he did say some of these troops were told to prepare for deployment within 5 days. What more do you know about the timeline here?
Well, no one really knows what Vladimir Putin is up to in Ukraine, and I suspect that the trigger for this sort of deployment, these are stateside troops going to Europe, would be kinetic action on behalf of the Russians. The Russian Foreign Ministry apparently was not read into this. One heard nothing about the troop buildup last fall. Political analysts in Moscow that one likes to read in the West also were caught unawares by this troop buildup. So really, there's a very small circle of decision makers around Vladimir Putin and Putin himself who will take this decision. So the Pentagon, I think, is waiting to see what the Russians are up to. If they actually do go in, then I would imagine that a deployment could follow relatively quickly as a way to provide assurances to our Eastern European allies. When might Putin go in? It's really anyone's guess, but I think there's a general consensus that the winter months are better for him, both militarily, given that the terrain will be frozen and mechanized divisions can move easier. Secondly, of course, we know that energy coercion is something Putin likes to play. He's adept at that game, and if he wants to blackmail Eastern Europe in the freezing winter months, might be the best for him. But the one complicating factor, of course, is the Winter Olympic Games, which are upcoming in Beijing, and Putin probably does not want to steal the limelight from Big Brother Xi in Beijing. And so I would suspect somewhere after the Olympics, perhaps even before in the coming days, one would see some sort of action, and that would trigger a deployment.
So Putin, the thinking generally goes, wants Ukraine to increase security for Russia, and because he doesn't want a potential NATO country in his backyard. But here we have his actions leading to more NATO troops building up on just the other side of Ukraine. Is that likely to diffuse the situation or to drive both sides forward here? I noticed earlier when you were talking about when this might happen, you seem to be dispensing with the if when it comes to Russia moving into Ukraine. Are we in a when, not if territory now?
Not entirely, but I think there is increasing consensus and agreement that it's likely there will be military action. And so I think that's an assumption on which a lot of analysts and operators and government officials are operating on. I would take you back to the adage from Lenin. It's much quoted, and I'm paraphrasing it, but basically the Russian way of coercive diplomacy. You have a bayonet, you push. If you hit mush, advance. When you hit steel, withdraw. And so I think deploying American troops in NATO countries, to which we do have a treaty commitment, is one way to show Putin a red line. Putin respects strength more than he does weakness. And so I would encourage the Biden administration to continue down this track.
Interesting, though. Do you think the Americans have a stomach, though, right now for any sort of American, interaction? Troop deployment, it's one thing to send them over there. It's another thing to have, American men and women fighting. Do you think there's an appetite for that?
Well, I would differentiate between NATO countries and Ukraine. Of course, Ukraine sits outside of NATO. The U.S. has military trainers in country. There are also reports of special operators who are in Ukraine helping to work with and outfit Ukrainian troops. Early on, I thought President Biden made a mistake when he took ground troops in Ukraine off the table because it took Putin inside of the president's thinking. I don't think there was a need to bring closure to that issue. Could have kept Putin guessing. But within the NATO borders themselves, which is to say within Europe, which is important, I think, for American prosperity, for American freedom, it's our spearhead in Eurasia for the competition, not just with Russia, but also for China. I think that is a red line that most Americans would get behind. Fighting in Ukraine might be one matter, although there's a lot more I think we can do in military materiel and assistance that does not mean spilling American blood. But I think for NATO states themselves, for which we've made a commitment, that's another question. And there, I think Americans are prepared to up the ante and to stand strong.
All right.
I don't know, Peter. To Tanya's point, over the weekend, lawmakers appearing on the Sunday show seemed to struggle to articulate why America would want to be involved and why American blood would potentially be shed there in Ukraine. But I do have a question to follow up on her point. If Ukraine falls to Vladimir Putin and nothing happens in response other than sanctions, which seem to roll off the backs of some of these leaders, could we see China taking a hungry look at Taiwan and maybe making a move there?
Well, for starters, just to clarify, I don't want to create the impression that U.S. troops are going to go die for Ukraine. I think there's a pretty large consensus that won't happen, or at least that ship has already sailed. But I do think for NATO itself, which are, of course, countries bordering Ukraine, there's a difference. Secondly, I would say all of these crises are connected, be it the Iranian nuclear negotiations in Vienna, Putin snarling at Ukraine, or China repeatedly probing Taiwan by violating its air identification zones with fighter jets, among other things. I think so long as these revisionist actors sense that the West is unwilling to stand up for itself, that it's weak, that the president can't rally the coalition, that there's decadence there, this escalatory pattern, this probing pattern will continue. So really the only recipe, paradoxical as it might seem, is to show some strength so that we can get to a point where there might be a standoff, but at least it's a stable standoff between those who want to do us harm and those who want to protect Western interests.
Peter's point that Putin responds to strength is a strong one.
I don't know, a stable standoff doesn't sound very peaceful.
Well, Peter Rao, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate your insight into these political matters. Thanks so much.
Thanks for having me.